I think you can see plenty of examples around the world where high levels of net migration have been good and others where high levels of net migration have been bad.
Julian makes an excellent rational case, but there's the political case here as well of how immigration makes communities feel. And people do not feel that it's made them better off.
People in the bond market are having less and less confidence in Britain's ability to manage its spending, manage its debt.
Easier to announce a policy on mass deportations than it is to say how you are actually going to tackle the consequences of decades of low growth.
From CapEx, this is The Capitalist. I'm Marc Sidwell, and my guests today are Alys Denby, opinion and features editor at City AM, and the economist Julian Jessop. On a recent edition of the BBC's Newsnight programme, Marine Khan, who's the economics editor for The Times, argued that Britain's fiscal health depends upon migration. The theory is that more workers means more output, yet GDP per capita tells another story. The UK is deep into a second decade of stagnation. Growth, of course, is about productivity, not just numbers. So how does migration really impact Britain's economic health? Julian, is it wrong to see high migration as an economic plus?
No, actually, I don't think it is. I think Marine Khan got a bit of an unfair press. If you watch the entire Newsnight interview rather than just the clip that they put out, I think it's pretty clear she does understand the limitations of migration in terms of boosting GDP per capita, which, as you say, is really, really important. But I think increased migration is still helpful. If you think about the overall size of the economy, then that does matter if you're thinking about how easy it is to fund your debt and your deficit. We normally think about, debt as a proportion of GDP. So if GDP is rising, even if driven by net migration, that still reduces the overall burden of debt. So there is something to be said for migration helping in that way. The key question is whether the migrants actually contribute in other ways to the economy and what they might mean for productivity. And I think you can see plenty of examples around the world where high levels of net migration have been good and others where high levels of net migration have been bad. So if you look at the good example, I think the best one in recent years has been Spain, where there have been pretty high levels of net migration. Headline GDP growth has been strong, but per capita GDP growth has been pretty good as well. And I think that's largely because the sort of people who've gone to work in Spain are younger, so they tend to be less of a burden on the healthcare system or social security payments than other people might be. They also tend to be sort of pretty well integrated into society. They're often Spanish speakers from Latin America who've come over. So I think Spain is a success story. At the other end, you've got some countries where there's been next to no migration at all, and they have suffered as a result. I think Japan is the prime example there. The lack of migration has contributed to the problems there for many decades, including many years of basically zero growth and economic stagnation more generally. But then you've had some countries, and I think I would include the UK here, but also Canada, where very high levels of net migration probably have been negative, because the people that have been coming, they themselves might have been quite productive, but often they brought quite large families with them. So in many cases, they have turned out to be a burden on the wider economy, the welfare system, and tax and benefits. So there has to be an optimal level of migration that sort of ticks all the positive boxes and has no significant downsides. I think the current levels of migration into the UK are far too high, but I don't necessarily think reducing those numbers to zero will be positive either.
Alys, Julian, talking there about sort of the different mixes and how that can help or hinder. Do you think in the UK we've got the skills mix wrong? We've brought in too many low-skilled immigrants and maybe not enough at the higher levels where they're contributing more to the economy?
I think that's plainly the case, yes. I mean, I think I would say that, of course, as Julian says, migration is very important for a competitive economy, particularly in sectors like here in the city of London, in tech startups. You do need to have an internet competitive immigration system that's able to attract talent from around the world. But I think it's clear in terms of per capita GDP growth that that's what people really feel. So Julian makes an excellent rational case, but there's the political case here as well of how immigration makes communities feel. and people do not feel that it's made them better off. I think it's clear, as Julian said, that people are bringing in far too many dependents and so on who are not net contributors to the economy. And ultimately, look, we know that the low growth is absolutely terrible for political stability, right? And the immigrants are always an easy scapegoat when people are feeling like things are getting worse, like they're not that things aren't working, that people don't have a stake in society, and that their lives are not going to be better from those of the parents. So I think we're seeing a combination of these things together. I think we are seeing immigration becoming far more politically toxic issue, and I think the causes of that are very deep-seated and are ultimately economic. And it is the result of the fact that we just haven't seen economic benefits from the high levels of migration that we've got.
Julian,
can I push
go
back
on.
a little bit about one point there, which is the idea that higher paid migrants are necessarily more useful than lower paid or lower skilled. I think that might be the case in some areas. So I'm thinking, for example, of fruit pickers coming over here and doing seasonal work. There is some evidence that farmers effectively have become lazy. They're relying too much on cheap foreign labour coming in rather than investing a bit more in the machinery and equipment to pick the fruit more effectively. So that's an example where low skilled migrants aren't necessarily adding that much. But there are other areas that we talk about low skilled. What they really mean is low paid. So that's areas like social care, where there's definitely been a shortage of British people, for want of a better way of putting it, who are willing to do those jobs. So we have effectively imported a lot of workers from the rest of the world, places like the Philippines, to do those jobs. Now, that may not be contributing massive amounts in terms of headline economic growth, but it has two big positives. One is, of course, it's allowing our care homes to survive when otherwise they might fail, and some of our most vulnerable people will be left short. But also, it's freeing up people in this country, if you like, to move up the value chain. So rather than people having to work in care homes or to look after the relatives themselves at home, we can import people who are willing to do that for us. So I think this is a very, very complicated position where I think it would be wrong to say that, for example, high pay is better than low pay, or that all migration is bad. There are plenty of examples where even low paid, low skilled workers can contribute enormously, even doesn't necessarily show through in the headline GDP figures.
Yeah, and of course I'd agree with that. I would add, I guess, that fruit pickers come on seasonal visas, right, and then they go away again. So as far as I know, they don't contribute to the overall figures. But I think we've been sold a lot of arguments about different kinds of migration. And for example, international students, I remember after Brexit, I remember when I was editing CapEx at the time, in fact, we ran lots of articles saying that international students were going to be an enormous benefit to Britain's economy. They were going to train here. They were going to, they would go away, but they would have this amazing attitude to Britain, and this would be great for us around the world. And as a result, we allowed people to bring in family members. We allowed them to stay for several years after completing their education. And many of them, I think, have then gone on to have permanent jobs here without actually earning what we might have expected them to do. So I just do think we've absolutely got the skills mix wrong as a result of deliberate policy choices.
Julian, there's another issue here as well, which is the big problem we have with economic inactivity inside the UK. I mean, what is it? Something like 9 million working age Brits who are currently not economically active. And, in the face of that, those aren't people who can move up the value chain. They're people who are, not doing the jobs that we then bring in low-skilled or low-paid people to do instead. But do you think we need to work out a way to tackle that?
Well, again, I think we need to break the figures down. I mean, a lot of those people who are described as economically inactive, what that means is they're not doing paid employment. And they might, for example, be at home looking after children or elderly relatives. So ironically, immigration could help there by freeing those people up to go and do paid work. A lot of those people who are economically inactive, of course, are economically inactive because they've been diagnosed with a health condition, real or perhaps in some cases exaggerated. Again, it's possible by importing immigrants that might be able to boost the amount of social care and support the NHS and so on. We could help to get some of those people back into work. So I think immigration might have a positive role to play here in getting those people back into work. But equally, there are arguments the other way. It may well be a lot of people who are economically inactive have made the rational decision that it isn't worth doing so because, wages at the lower end have been depressed by the ability to import cheap migrant labour, or more likely the tax and benefit system is providing all sorts of disincentives for them to work. So in answer to the question about high levels of economic inactivity, I think you need to look at why particular people are economically inactive. What are the incentives facing them? What are the constraints that prevent them from working? And tackling those on a sort of group by group basis.
Alys, you were talking a little earlier about the migrants sort of serving as scapegoats in a way for the low growth conditions we find ourselves in. And Britain clearly has very big economic problems at the moment. We're watching the gilt markets today, which are yields going through the roof as people in the bond market are having less and less confidence in Britain's ability to manage its spending, manage its debt. Do you think that this is all something of a diversion from the real ongoing fiscal mess that we're in and the policies we need to tackle?
I think yes and no. I mean, I do worry that immigration, migrant hotels, small boats make for very easy headlines. And in fact, in some ways, easier to announce a policy on mass deportations than it is to say how you are actually going to tackle the consequences of decades of low growth. But I think the two are fundamentally interlinked. I mean, Julian talks about disincentives to work. And I think many people growing up in this country feel like it is a disincentive to work. The idea that if you can just come here illegally on a boat, you can get put up in a hotel, you can get benefits, you can access the NHS. That many people that a life on benefits is actually just an easier solution than working and contributing to this country. So I don't think you can disentangle the effects of immigration. And let's be clear, it's not headline numbers. It's not immigration itself. It's the promise of successive governments that these numbers were going to come down, and the failure to deliver on those promises that has broken political trust. I think, clearly, whatever the numbers say, whatever headline GDP says, if you are living in a community that you've seen fundamentally change over the years, if you're living next to a migrant hotel where people are harassing your teenage daughter, it's completely rational to think that immigration is the problem. You and I might know that actually there are more deep-seated causes, but the two are fundamentally linked.
I absolutely agree with that. I, as an economist, often fall in the trap of just thinking about this in terms of GDP per capita, whatever else it might be. I mean, there's a whole host of issues around high levels of immigration that go beyond the normal economic sphere, and obviously Alys has touched on those. So I think there is a danger that some of the people that have been driving policy over the last few years have been focused purely on that sort of narrow economic question. Is this good for the size of the economy and the potential tax take, and not thinking about those broader issues? I think the trust in government question is absolutely critical. If you ask most people, what is the basic function of government that's the single most important thing they should do, it will be something around national security. And that's both about external defense, but also about, protecting the borders and protecting the people walking around on the streets. And I think successive governments have clearly failed to do that.
Yeah, well, let's narrow in on one of the particular flashpoints of these topics that you're talking about, and Alys raised it briefly, which is the migrant hotels. Now, Yvette Cooper says the government will end hotel accommodation for migrants by 2029, which is, of course, not nearly fast enough for some. Meanwhile, Epping Council's legal fight over the Bell Hotel has sparked a wave of similar challenges with a judicial review due in October, and I believe Epping Council has now said that it's minded to take its case all the way to the Supreme Court after it lost in the Court of Appeal. If the Home Office loses, councils could gain new leverage. So should local authorities decide how their premises are used? Alys, we're not normally in favour of NIMBYs in CapEx, as weren't under your watch either. But this is something of a sort of successful NIMBY campaign that's gained some ground. Do you think local authorities are within their rights to try and control this?
Yeah, I completely agree. This is a strange example of a NIMBY campaign that I think a lot of CapEx readers would support. I also think it's a total indictment of the planning system that this was the route that was chosen to tackle this problem. Of the chaotic and complexity of the planning system enabled them to appeal that this wasn't the original purpose of the hotel, and therefore these migrants should be chucked out. With really what it should be is it should be a matter of immigration policy, right? It should be a matter of a Westminster decision on how you're going to control your own borders. Look, I think it's plain that local communities have had enough of living alongside migrant hotels. And when you read some of the stories about the behaviour of the people living there, you can see why. You plainly can't have hundreds of young single men put into a hotel with nothing to do in a small, probably quite impoverished community without causing a lot of tension. I think obviously we have to house these people somewhere. So ideally, as Yvette Cooper has talked about, we need to speed up the asylum process. We need to either deport them as quickly as we can, or if they are successful in their asylum applications, put them in more appropriate accommodation. I know CapEx and other outlets have long been making the case for other kinds of accommodation, whether that be on military facilities. I think there's it could actually be a great boon for the construction industry, for example, because you could have temporary modular housing. We need somewhere more appropriate to house these people, somewhere that's safe and humane. But I think for too long, the rights to accommodation for these asylum seekers have been privileged over the rights of the local communities that are having to tolerate them, and something needs to change.
Julian, it seems like there's a sort of political deadlock over this. I mean, the Tories tried hard, and they tried things like the Bibby Stockholm barge as an alternative to the hotels, which was a complete flop and a disaster. Lots of other things get suggested, but nothing quite seems to work. Do you think there is an answer, or is it going to involve something much bigger, which no one seems to have the ambition for yet, which is like reforming the Refugee Convention, or people talk a lot about leaving the ECHR in order to limit the ability for asylum claims? Do you see any way through?
Well, I think there are a number of things you have to do, and this comes back to partly looking at it like an economist would. So, for a start, the existing system is clearly ridiculously expensive. You've got the billions of pounds being spent on the hotels themselves, but also the wider costs to society, as Alys outlined very well, and the opportunity cost of these hotels that often are in quite nice seaside towns that can't be used to generate tourism revenues and to support local people more directly in that way. So the current situation is not sustainable. As an economist, I think you need to look at the incentives for people to come here. I think there was probably something in the Rwanda scheme that could still be revived. The fact that if you come here, then there's a significant chance that you're going to be sent back straight away to somewhere else you might not want to be. I think you need to look at other issues as well. I'm not, as it happens, a huge fan of identity cards, but I think this is a conversation we need to have around here about why people would much rather come and try and find work in the UK economy than in France. And that's partly because it's so much harder to regulate who comes to work here because we don't have identity cards. Now, as I say, I'm not a fan of that, but I think that's a discussion that we need to have. As for the ECHR, then I think there's an increasingly strong case for reviewing our relationship with the European courts here. And it's interesting, it's not just so-called right-wingers that are saying this. A number of prominent Labour figures who've held senior jobs, including former Home Secretaries, are saying that something's gone wrong here. So I'm absolutely not suggesting removing those rights. I'm suggesting interpreting those rights more sensibly than they seem to be at the moment by European courts. So I think there has to be a legal approach to this as well as an economic and a humanitarian perspective.
Alys, just before we move on to our final topic, what's your take on leaving the ECHR? Do you think that would work, or is there a risk that we'd leave and then we'd still find that through some other legal loophole we were still suffering with the same problem?
I don't think it's the ultimate solution, but I absolutely think that it's something we should do. I've long thought that. I thought it would make much more sense to leave the ECHR than it did to leave the EU, for example. I think that was a much greater source of some of the issues that were talked about during the Brexit campaign. I absolutely agree with Julian Jessop that this is no longer some far-right reformy opinion. It's plenty of perfectly sensible moderate voices like David Blunkett, like Malcolm Rifkin, like Jonathan Sumption, who've said that this piece of law is no longer fit for the modern world. And of course not. Things have changed since the 1950s. It was brought in for very good reasons, but not to cope with a time of mass migration. It was never meant to apply to potentially hundreds of millions of people having a right, so-called, to come to Britain. So I absolutely think that we should leave it. And I think the best possible person in the entire world to make that case is Keir Starmer, an internationally respected human rights lawyer. He could argue that he's uniquely placed to make the argument that we need a new human rights framework that respects the rights of asylum seekers, that protects people from torture, but that also respects the rights of sovereign nation, and that's fit for the modern world. And I think he should do it, but I don't think he will, because he just comes from a very different world.
maybe on his next relaunch, which may follow the latest one that he started this week. Well, finally today, let's move on to a very political topic, which is support for electoral reform, which has reached a record 60%. Once seen as a guarantor of stability, Britain's first-past-the-post system now seems to risk handing power to parties with minority support, as reform, often on the back of concerns about migration, continues to rise in the polls. A report from the Compass think tank shows proportional systems elsewhere have tempered populist extremes. So should Labour act before Reform UK rides 30% of the vote to number 10? Julian, it's often been seen by the major parties that first past the post was a way to keep out the contenders, the insurgent parties. But now with Reform doing so well and both Labour and the Conservatives having fallen back, it seems like nothing can stop them. Do you think this is a moment when electoral reform might be possible?
Well, I don't think that's the right way of looking at it. I don't think that electoral reform should be based on the results that you hope it's going to deliver. We saw an example of this, of course, with the Labour's desire to allow children, 16 and 17-year-olds, to vote. And I'm sure they hope that would bolster their support. But the latest evidence suggests that it will primarily bolster support either for parties like Reform or some of the far left parties, whether that's the Greens or whatever Jeremy Corbyn's new party is going to be called. So I think it's very dangerous to base electoral reform on what you hope the results of that reform will be. I would just stick to first principles. What is most likely to deliver a stable and reasonably representative government? And there are clearly trade-offs here. If you want the most representative government, then some form of proportional representation is obviously right. But then you tend to result in unstable governments where the balance of power can actually be held by parties who only have a few percentage points of the vote. So I tend to come back to preferring first past the post. I mean, it does deliver governments that do have reasonably strong mandates for 5 years. I remember, of course, the Labour Party. I mean, Labour Party's problems now are not caused by it not having a majority in Parliament. It's got a sizable majority in Parliament. It just doesn't seem to have the courage or the drive to use that. So I'm still a fan of first past the post for the pragmatic reason it tends to deliver more stable governments rather than shuffling the system around in order to try and deliver results that some people might think are preferable.
Alys, would you agree with that? Do you think that if we stick with first past the post, we need to find the party that actually wants to act decisively, but at least if they got in, they could make some big changes?
Yeah, I completely agree with Julian. I don't like the idea of gerrymandering the outcome of an election. Let's not forget we had a referendum on changing our voting system and the British public rejected it. Let's also not forget that first past the post delivered a coalition government that was in fact more stable than any government we've seen recently. And that was the result of first past the post. I think that also first past the post encourages each party in itself to be a coalition. And that's what we're seeing with Labour. We're seeing that even though it has this huge majority, it has deep divides within it. But I actually think that's probably quite a good way of trying to resolve problems by having, maybe you've got different beliefs or different factions, but ultimately you have the shared goal of getting one particular party elected. I'm also sort of a small c conservative on first past the post. I think we should keep it. I don't like the idea of, just as one parliament can't bind another, I don't see why, because of these particular political circumstances we have now, we need to throw out a system that's done us fine for hundreds of years. I think the one thing I am more sympathetic to, for the reasons Julian lined out, is votes at 16. Because I think it's right that these people are not just axiomatically all going to vote Labour now, but what they might do is make the case to politicians that they need to care more about young people and that it's not only pensioners who vote.
Julian, do you think that first past the post can work with our increasingly fractured political system? Because even if we stick with it, as Alys was suggesting, we've got all these different parties now. We've got the Green Party that's now under new leadership, increasingly becoming a sort of radical part of the economic left. We've got Jeremy Corbyn's new party, which is sort of still trying to work out even what it's called. We've got Reform, of course, the Tories, Lib Dems. It's a much bigger picture than it used to be with just two main parties. Do you think the system can still work with just first past the post, with all of these different factions in play?
Well, again, I'm wary of designing an electoral system based on what the current political map looks like. I suspect actually that the fracturing that we're seeing at the moment might only be temporary. That we effectively there's a massive protest vote against the traditional two leading parties, the Conservatives and Labour, and so people are willing to vote for alternatives that they wouldn't otherwise normally do. But I think if you did adopt a proportional representation system, that would just cement that into the political system, whereas it might only be a temporary feature of the fact that the last few governments have been pretty useless. So hopefully that would increase the pressure on the mainstream parties to get their act together and to get those votes back, rather than the electoral system basically condemning them to oblivion forever.
Yeah, well, a note of hope there, perhaps for the Conservatives, a vision where they aren't just permanently relegated to being one of the sort of minor runners-up in the roster of parties. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to both my guests, Alys Denby and Julian Jessop. Make sure you'll subscribe to our daily email briefings. Go to capex.co. That's capx.co. I'm Marc Sidwell. Goodbye.